welcome to another video in the series Archaeology in Islam. My name is Dan Gibson, and today we want to examine a question that viewers have asked about the prophets Abraham and Job, or in Arabic, Ibrahim and Ayub. The reason for this is that many scholars cast doubt on the stories of Job and Abraham in the Bible and in the Quran. They say these stories are so ancient that they cannot be true. Now, I cannot prove that they're true, but I think we can answer some of the objections they make against these prophets, such as claims that the civilizations and the peoples mentioned could not have been there at that time. There are two types of arguments used against Job and Abraham. The first one is the old absence of evidence is evidence of absence. What this means is, if the old records talk about an unknown group of people or an unknown place, then these are just people or places that someone invented when they were telling the story. The argument is that they're just made-up places or people. So in this video, we want to examine some of these so-called made-up people. The second argument is that the people who were named, like the Chaldeans in both stories, are way too early. These kingdoms didn't exist until many years later, at least 500 to 600 years. So the writer had to write after that time. They could not have written about them so early. They are good arguments, but will they stand the test of archaeology and the most recent discoveries? So let's start with the Chaldeans. This is one of the main arguments that I hear. These are mentioned in Job chapter 1. 3 bands of Chaldeans attack Job's herd of 3,000 camels, and they steal them away. There are two arguments made. First, they argue that camels had not been domesticated at this time. And the second is that the Chaldean Empire came 600 years later. Now, the Chaldean argument is also raised against Ibrahim, as it says he was from Ur of the Chaldees. Again, remember, Chaldeans were far too early, this being coming up in the story because they were much later. Well, let's start with the idea of the domesticated camels. I don't know who started that argument. I know it was going around in the 1940s with Albright, and he mentions it, but since then a number of studies have been carried out about the domestication of camels in the Middle East, and that number keeps being pushed back, 2000 BC, and then later pushed back to 3000 BC. Early on, Professor Edward Lipinski stated, camels seem to have been domesticated in Arabia since the 3rd millennium BC. But there was no proof at that time other than what he was pulling out of the records. But now several studies have come out in the last years demonstrating the domestication of camels in Arabia prior to 2000 BC, and petroglyphs occur on the rocks in southern Jordan and in Saudi. They confirm this, showing the presence of camels dating back to the 3rd millennium BC. So anyone who comes up with this argument that about camels, it's a very old argument. It no longer stands. But I still hear some people using the domestication of camels as an argument. And I'm sorry, camels were domesticated very early. So that brings us up to the Chaldeans and the Ur of the Chaldees. First of all, some people point to the Chaldean Empire, which existed from the 9th to the 6th century BC, and they claim that it's far too late for Job and Abraham. Biblical chronologists place the book of Job about 140 years before Moses, so they place the misfortunes of Job around 1640 BC. And so some archaeologists argue that the Chaldeans and the Sabians left traces only from the 10th century, so you're 6 centuries early. Since Abraham left Ur around 1960 BC, it was too early for the Chaldeans and the Sabians, and at that time the city of Ur was in the land of Sumer, and his city was ruled over by the people of Sumer, so this wasn't the Chaldeans. Now the argument sounds convincing at first, till we just think about it for a few minutes. First of all, Abraham was not a Sumerian, nor a Babylonian. He was a Hebrew, a descendant of Eber. We have his genealogy. Like most of the inhabitants of Sumer, they were not actually Sumerians, whose language and ethnic background collapsed in 1912 BC. So someone writing during the time of the Chaldeans later would have referred to it as the city of Ur of the Chaldees, in much the same way that I refer to Petra of southern Jordan, rather than Petra of the Nabateans, or Petra of the Romans, or Petra of the Byzantines, or Petra of, well, you pick whoever you want to pick. So the term Ur of the Chaldees tells us more about when the story was written down than when it actually took place. Also remember that there are areas of Ur in southern Babylon. This was marshland, and the Babylonians set aside a city there for wisdom, for study, for philosophers, for astronomers. The people there had occupations and like this, and they were called Chaldeans because of their occupation. At the same time, Strabo tells us that there were ethnic people called Chaldeans, and he gives us the names of some of the sub-tribes, like the Urukians or the Bosporians or whatever. So I remember once a historian was reviewing something I'd written, and he looked at when I wrote Petra in Jordan, and he said, no, you're writing about the time of Muhammad. You shouldn't say Petra in Jordan, because Jordan is modern, Muhammad is ancient. You're putting these two things together. Now, the reason I did that was to clearly communicate what city I was referring about to my audience. I was thinking of the modern audience, not some academic audience of whom I have great appreciation. In the same way, the writers of the biblical story of Job and Abraham, which was traditionally been considered as Moses, he was communicating to his audience that Abraham came from Ur of the Chaldees. Now this said a lot. His family was part of that educated, philosopher-thinking family of his day. It was during that time Ur was actually under Sumer, but his audience didn't know Sumer. They were aware of Ur of the Chaldees, even because he was writing much later, and so they were aware of that, and so that's how he makes his identification. So there should not be an issue for writers identifying Abraham from being from there, because he's trying to say he's from that city, from those people. This is why it's mentioned. Abraham did what was not expected of him. He turned his back on the education, on all the prestige coming out of that city. He went out and became a nomad. And he was trusting that God would show him where he would go, and the time would come when he should move or where he would stay. Now, if you want to investigate the background of the Chaldean tribe before they set up the kingdom in southern Babylon, or should I say Iraq, or was it called Mesopotamia? No, that was a Greek term. The Babylonians never called themselves Mesopotamia. Yet I hear people applying the Greek term to them all the time. It's not Mesopotamia. Is it Sumer? Is it Babylon? Is it Akkad? There's so many different names here. But the Chaldeans, they were in the Levant, and they moved over to Babylon. So what does this mean? The Chaldean tribes, when they attacked Job, they fit the chronology because at that time they were nomads in the Levant, and later they moved. They're Semitic people, spoke the West Semitic language. They moved over to Babylon, and there they became part of the Chaldeans in Babylon and set up their kingdom there. So you see, the problem of having Ur of the Chaldees or Ur of Babylon or Ur of Sumer or Ur of Iraq or whatever there is all about when it was written rather than the time they are writing about. Now, if you examine history using timelines, then these terms are not such an issue. Even the Sabians, who were nomadic at the time, were traveling slowly south, moving down towards Yemen, where they would eventually set up a kingdom. They were nomads at the time of Job. Later they had their kingdom, so it fits absolutely perfect. But remember what we said back in the previous video: nomads leave very little archaeological evidence. No great cities, no great stones, nothing behind. Now, I lived with the Bedouin for a number of years, and while I was there, I heard a number of stories about tribal nomadic sheikhs from several hundred years ago. They were famous in their day, but they never built a building, never wrote their name on stone, never minted any coins. The only place they survive is in the tribal chronologies memorized by the tribes and in the poems or stories written about them. Now, the other day I was cleaning out a drawer and I came across a very old cassette tape and some floppy disks and so forth. Do you remember these? Cassette tapes were invented in my lifetime in 1962, and already they're disintegrating. That's right. Cassette tapes, 8 tracks, were invented within 2 years of each other. And in less than 10, when I was probably 10 years old, something like that. And now, in my lifetime, they're stretched, they're falling apart, you see the magnetic stuff coming off of them. I remember once riding in an old beat-up pickup truck with some Bedouins in the desert, and he had maybe a dozen cassette tapes, all just on the dash of the truck. Do you remember those days? The dust blowing in from the desert, and all around the cab were bits and pieces of cassette tapes because they would break, and he would stop and pull out the tape and get a stick and try to dig it out and then wind it back up and stick it back in so he could still listen to it. And so those were the old days. I think there are bits and pieces of broken cassette tapes all over the deserts of Arabia. And what a horrible failure. This was the reason why we don't use them today. And among the debris are also now broken CDs. I see them there, and the silver coming off of them and so forth. You see, all down through history, mankind has struggled to find a good way to preserve knowledge. What lasts long enough to pass on from one generation to another? Everything we use is fragile. Paper's been pretty good in the last few years, but it's not perfect. I remember once a lady owned several hundred books, and she lived in the Emirates, and at the time she decided to go back to the West to get some more education, so she packed up all her books and all her belongings and put them in wooden crates, and they were to be placed in storage. Or so she thought. Actually, they were supposed to go in storage, but they sat outside in the sand for a few months, temporarily forgotten. Then I got a job working there, and one day I asked, "What are those crates sitting outside in the sand?" Somebody said, "Oh, I remember about this lady." So I got the tractor, I went over, and we got some of the men to help, and we moved these boxes, we got them on a cement area, and I opened them up. And guess what I found? Termites had built their tunnels into the bottom of the crate. Termites love wood, but they love paper even better. Pre-digested, processed wood. Oh, they love it. And the books in the crate were riddled with termite holes, going every which way in them. They spread out, we spread them out, and we had to go through all those books. And threw out a lot of books, because termites destroy. Fire destroys, wars destroy, floods destroy. They can all damage books. The great libraries of Alexandria and of Celsus and of Pergamon and of Ctesiphon, they're all stark reminders of how fragile paper is, or vellum, or whatever we're writing on. So if you were wealthy, you could write on a stone, perhaps on the walls of a temple, or a memorial stone you could set up. You could hire a scribe to write on clay tablets, and if you were not wealthy, you might even put a few lines on a rock in the desert while you were watching your sheep. But none of those contain long inscriptions. There's no poetry or long histories or chronologies on the desert rocks. But the Bedouin in Arabia found a way to preserve knowledge over multiple generations. It was called poetry. But this poetry wasn't written in books. It was written on the hearts of men and women. You see, a good poem just sticks with you. When I was in high school many years ago, I read a good poem. I was fascinated by it, so I started to memorize it. It was called The Cremation of Sam McGee. It starts like this. There are strange things done under the midnight sun by the men who moil for gold. The Arctic trails have their secret tales that would make your blood run cold. The northern lights have seen strange sights, but the queerest they ever did see was that night on the marge of Lake LaBarge I cremated Sam McGee. Now, Sam McGee was from Tennessee, where the cotton blooms and blows. Why, he left his home in the south to roam, and that land of cold God only knows. Now see, that's just the beginning. It goes on and on and on. And even I misquoted it, and I missed one line. And so You see, poetry is there, but people say, see, it's not good because you misquoted it. But the beauty of poetry is that you meet other people and you quote the poem and they correct you because they have also memorized it. And so it is corrected by each other. And that happened to me just a few weeks ago with that very poem. And I got corrected and I thought, you know what? You're right. I did. I missed a piece on that in that poetry. And I've seen that scenario in Bedouin tents. People who neither read nor write, repeating line after line of ancient poetry. And then, every once in a while, I'm in some academic setting and someone will make a derogatory remark about the inaccuracy of orality. And I cringe, because there's nothing worse than being corrected by a whole room full of people when you're trying to repeat a famous story. I remember hearing a Bedouin recite the genealogy of his tribe, going back generation after generation, and he stumbled, and two older men corrected him in a nice way. They prompted him. They encouraged him. In this day and age of television and internet, I know it's hard to imagine a group of people sitting around the glowing coals of a fire in the pitch black night reciting poetry in the desert or some ancient genealogy. In homes all across the Muslim world, children memorize sections of the Quran. And Bedouin, many who cannot read or write, will gather for Friday prayers and they will recite together from the Quran. In other parts of the world, Christians will memorize parts of the Bible. I've met people who've memorized large parts of the Bible. Whole sections are memorized. Friends, orality is alive and well in some parts of the world. When war ravages, when electricity fails, when fire destroys, when floods wash away, all that may survive is the knowledge that is hidden away in the heads of those who memorize. If you think that once something is digitized, it's preserved forever, think again. The digital age is only a few decades old. I wonder how long our digital records will last. Just go to Iraq or go to Syria and see how much has survived there after the war. Now, the next major world war may wipe out a great deal of our knowledge. But the poetry and the genealogies and the memorized verses of religious wisdom, I think, will survive and will be written down again in that post-apocalyptic world. Now, let's go back to Job and Abraham. We have their stories, not written in stone, but written in Old Hebrew. Yes, at those Qumran caves where they discovered those ancient manuscripts, they found many scrolls, including parts of Genesis, Exodus, and Leviticus, written in Paleo-Hebrew, the earliest form of the Hebrew language. Also a copy of Job written there. Paleo-Hebrew and Proto-Canaanite date back to 1550 and 1480 BC. They're amazingly close to the much later stone found at Tel Zayat, which contained Proto-Hebrew from 500 years later. We don't have time for all of the arguments made about Abraham, but the one main one is about a man named Chedorlaomer and his campaign against Sodom. The New Testament mentions this, so it was taken as a true story. Now, one of the problems is that not all of history is fixed, and for instance, the Babylonian chronology is still not fixed. Arguments still are made by scholars about different kings in different times. So anyone who claims that scholars are 100% sure that this man never existed, they're just trying to convince you. Now, when T.G. Pinchas, that was in 1856, he lived to 1935, he was an Assyriologist at the University of London and at the University of Liverpool. He published his writings back then, and he came up with all different kinds of names, and he tried to line up different kings with the different kings, and his work was thrown away. Scholars proved it was not the connections that he was trying to make. And so what happened was, because the first identification failed at who this man was, it was assumed all would fail, and it all passed away. But recently, a paper called Abraham and Chedorlaomer, Chronological, Historical, and Archaeological Evidence, changed all of that. The author linked Chedorlaomer with Kudr Kudumal, a king of Elam, and he's made many very persuasive arguments. His paper is freely available on the internet. I've read it in detail. Others, such as Dr. Hermann Hunger, professor of Archeology at the University of Vienna, he's examined this paper and he's written papers in support of it. So anyone who claims that Chedorlaomer never existed is accepting an argument was made over a century ago without any regard to modern research. So what does this tell us? First of all, many of the old arguments used against Abraham and Job no longer stand. One by one, archaeologists are uncovering evidence that support the existence of these men and the story that was written long ago. The main argument used against the existence of Job and Abraham now is that scholars personally prefer not to believe in them. That's just their choice. In some cases, they're making a judgment call, but there are certainly no outstanding claims against what has been written down, that these are very old stories and that they date back to the times that they claim to date. But it's always been with the prophets that it's been a personal choice whether someone accepts them and follows them. I cannot prove them to you. At some point, archaeology ends and faith begins. That's why, as a historian, I'm interested in the historicity of the early prophets. And as I've studied it up to the time of Jesus, I find them sound. There is evidence to support them. But when I came to Muhammad, I began to find a different story. Mosques were pointing to Petra, not Mecca. All kinds of circumstantial evidence supported Petra in the modern-day Jordan, not Mecca in Saudi Arabia. And so that's why we're making these videos and writing these books, trying to figure this out. I'm Dan Gibson, and this has been another video in the series Archaeology and Islam.